happy to introduce you Marco Pasi, professor of University of Amsterdam, one of the leading researchers of Western Esotericism. I have a book in hand, but today we are not going to talk about
a little bit.
Very good, very good. And at the same time, Marco is General Secretary of the European Association for Study of Religion, and actually you came here to inspect our society. And I'm glad that there is so many of us here. But yeah, I think it's time to give floor to you, and you're really very welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to thank the Estonian Society for the Study of Religion and the colleagues here in Tartu for inviting me here. In fact, I am here especially to have a look at the place since, as you know, the Estonian Society is organizing a big conference next year of the European Association, for which we are very grateful. And so, as it is normal, sometime before the conference itself, it's good to go and meet the organizing committee, have a look around. And so I hope to see you all actually next year, next summer, when the conference will be here. Okay, so let's just get started. What I am going to do here today is to talk about sex and esotericism. And I am going to focus especially on the social and cultural aspects of this strange relationship, sex and esotericism. So there will be two parts in my lecture. The first part will be about some general issues, so to speak. So a kind of introduction to this relationship, and with a special focus then on these general social and cultural aspects. And the second part of the lecture will be more about one particular aspect of this relationship. So a kind of zooming in a little bit into one of the diverse aspects of this relationship, also keeping in mind that it's important to have an idea of what it means to do research on these kind of subjects. So how difficult it is, what is the complexity, and so with a kind of case study, I hope I will be able to give you an idea of this. So let's just get started. Sex has always been an important component of Western esotericism, even if not necessarily the most visible one. But sex is, of course, a very generic term which can refer to different aspects in what is a broad area of human experience. So these are the four most important aspects that this relationship between sex and esotericism can take. So first of all, it can relate to the concept of eros, or passionate loving attraction between two human beings, which may or may not involve physical contact. So it doesn't necessarily involve intercourse. The attraction is what is more important here. Now, starting especially with Plato, love understood in this erotic sense has been often perceived as a key factor not only in human relations, but also in the structure of the universe as a whole. In this sense, the universe is believed to function according to the same basic principles of attraction that regulate human life. So just as much as human beings attract each other, so also the universe as a whole is supposed to function in this way. Now, it is easy to find developments in this basic idea in important authors of the Renaissance, such as Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno, for whom the erotic principles of attraction, the occult powers of magic, and the dynamic structure of the universe are all part of a single continuum. Similarly, the myth of the primordial androgyne, which in Western culture has its roots in Plato also, would be used to explain the origin of erotic attraction between men and women and the polarized nature of sexuality and even of the universe as a whole. Another important aspect is the use of sexual symbolism in esoteric literature and visual culture. This may or may not imply a sexualized vision of the universe, as I have just described. So to give just one example, alchemical literature is full of images that have an erotic connotation. Just to give you an example here, a man and a woman who are making love in a kind of alchemical bottle that is supposed to be used for alchemical experiments. And this refers, of course, to a particular stage in the alchemical process, the transmutation of metals, which sometimes can also refer to the transmutation of the human self, so that the physical aspect of it relates also to a spiritual or religious aspect. And here we have the union of a female and male principle represented by the depiction of actual sexual intercourse, as you can see. Now, these images can be interpreted as referring to particular aspects of alchemical practice, and, as I said, so the combination of metals with each other, of material elements, and so on. A third aspect of the presence of sex in Western esotericism concerns not so much sex as a subject, but rather as an object. And this is relevant particularly in the context of forms of popular magic that claim to offer remedies to all problems related to the erotic sphere, such as unrequited loves, difficult pregnancies, or insufficient sexual potency. So you have all these kind of spells and rituals that are being used in order to solve these very basic problems of the human condition. Now, in the first two cases, sex is used as a framework of reference in order to explain aspects of reality. But this does not necessarily imply the actual use of sexual intercourse. Sex is more like a metaphor that serves to describe something, which is something else. But this doesn't mean that people were actually having sex. I mean, the alchemists and so on, or Giordano Bruno or Marsilio Ficino. On the other hand, in this case, in the third case, the presence of sex as a magical context is certainly more embodied and physical than in the first two. But this presence usually concerns more the intended goal of the magical practice, rather than its means. And this goal is specifically related to bodily functions, rather than spiritual progress. So when you do these kind of rituals and spells, it's not that you have in mind some kind of spiritual illumination, self-realization, and so on. Sometimes it's very basic stuff, like, you know, not being able to copulate, to have sex, and so you use these kind of spells in order to solve that problem. Now, this means that we are still quite far from the fourth aspect that we are going to talk about. Actually, my lecture will be focusing mostly on the fourth aspect, which is sexual magic. And sexual magic here is the explicit, self-conscious, formalized use of sexual acts generally, in an esoteric context. And for this we have to wait until the 19th century, whereas the other examples that I have given you can find also in earlier centuries. As I said, in fact, discourses about an erotic vision of the universe go back to Plato, so you can imagine about that. But the fourth case, so the actual use of sexual intercourse or other sexual acts in a magical or esoteric context, is actually much more recent, and it goes back to the 19th century. It's very difficult to find examples earlier. Now, this aspect of the relationship between esotericism and sex is usually referred as sexual magic. This development has been one of the most remarkable innovations in modern Western esotericism. And this development has a number of implications that I think it is crucial to discuss when we want to think about this relationship, sex and esotericism. So first of all, we may ask ourselves why sex should get mixed with esoteric or magical practices in the first place. So why does this connection exist? One easy answer might be that sex relates to a deep aspect of human existence, based on the universal impulse of reproduction, and that it would have been strange if esotericism, which has a kind of holistic approach to reality, would not include it sooner or later as a part of its experiential dimension. So esotericism covers most of the things that, you know, men and women do on this planet, so sooner or later the idea would have got into the mind of esotericists, so let's use sex as well. But I think there are also other aspects that should be taken into account. Sexual orgasm appears to be one of the easiest, most immediate, and I would say even cheapest ways for obtaining an intense altered state of consciousness, one that is potentially available to anyone without the use of exotic drugs or complicated bodily techniques. Unless you use Viagra, of course, but that's a different story. As is the case with other forms of alteration of consciousness, depending also on the social and cultural context, this peak experience can be perceived to have religious, mystical, or magical connotations. Now, if this is so, then one might ask why the use of sexual intercourse for magical or esoteric purposes was not much more common before the 19th century. So why didn't people start to use it before then, if it's so easy and easily available? Well, I think the answer is quite obvious and has to do with the strict policing of sexual behavior in a traditional mainstream Christian context. Sex has been used sex has been usually understood in that context, so in the context of traditional Christianity, to be exclusively functional to reproduction and frowned upon when practiced outside of the thought boundaries of this function. Therefore, it would have been difficult to even conceive of sexual practices for religious or magical purposes in that context. When considering the fact that a new interest in sex emerged in esoteric movements during the second half of the 19th century, one should take various factors into account. On the one hand, it is certainly interesting to see that this development started out in the Victorian period. So we are talking about the 19th century, so let's say Victorian period, which applies mostly, of course, to the vast empire of Great Britain at the time, but sometimes this notion of the Victorian period is applied more generally to the West, so to speak, so also to other countries. Now, during this Victorian period, all expressions of sexuality were subjected to heavy censorship and social control. Not so much from religious institutions, as may have been the case in earlier historical periods, but by a generalized feeling of public decency that was widespread also in secular institutions, so not just the churches, but this is something that filtered through also secular institutions. Now, it is well known that Michel Foucault, in his History of Sexuality, has criticized the simplistic stereotypical image of sexual repression, which he called the repressive hypothesis. But it remains true that for many people who had a direct experience of this kind of climate, of this kind of atmosphere, the subjective feeling of living in a period that had a negative obsession about sexuality was very real and could become even more strong when some of these persons lived long enough to see the end of this period and then, with hindsight, compare it to the more relaxed atmosphere that came after it. So, mostly the period after the First World War. Now, I think quite a few examples could be given of this, and here is, for instance, what the famous Austrian writer Stefan Zweig remembered in his World of Yesterday, a fantastic book that he wrote just before committing suicide in 1942, desperate about the war that was raging in Europe at the time. So this is what he has to say about the attitude towards sexuality that was predominant in his youth. Our century looked upon sexuality as an anarchical and therefore disturbing element, which had no place in its ethics and which was not allowed to see the light of day, because every form of extramarital love was in opposition to middle-class decency. School and church, salon and courts, newspapers and books, modes and manners, in principle avoided every mention of the problem. And even science, whose real task would have been to approach all problems impartially, shamefully subscribed to the naturalia sunt turpia. So, all natural things are shameful. So that's the kind of memory that he had of this period. Now, it is certainly noteworthy that the emergence of sexual magic took place in a historical context in which sexuality was so severely repressed. and censored by mainstream culture, both in its religious and secular aspects. We might therefore see it as a form of antinomianism, as if a radicalization of an anti-sex attitude from the top down would have produced or at least stimulated a reaction of sexual curiosity and experimentation from the bottom up, similar, for instance, to pornography or libertinism. But this is probably only one aspect of the story. Another aspect is the deep cultural change that begins to take place during the second half of the 19th century, and which becomes particularly evident in the early years of the 20th century. As a result of processes of social transformation, often subsumed under the generic and also controversial label of secularization, it is the whole relationship with the body that begins to change in this period. The body becomes the focus of renewed positive attention, with the underlying idea that a good life implies sustained cultivation, care, so that you have to take care of your body. And it is in fact in this period that we see the emergence of sport as a regular practice, not just as a pastime or a hobby, but also as a way to keep one's body healthy and fit. Fashion also changes, making it easier to expose the body to fresh air and sunlight. And an interest in naturism, vegetarianism, and physical activity in natural environments begins to make itself visible. And these are all practices, by the way, that especially in the German-speaking countries were part of the so-called Lebensreform movement, so the movement for the reformation of life. Persons who shared these new concerns about bodily health often had an interest in alternative spirituality and esoteric ideas, as was the case in the early years of the 20th century in the famous community of Monte Verità, in Ascona, in the Italian part of Switzerland. You may have heard about it. And Monte Verità was just one of the many alternative communities that sprang up in that period between the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, where all these kind of alternative forms of life, styles of life were practiced, naturism, vegetarianism, nudism, and so on. But now, what is sexual magic? To get back to the main point. Most forms of sexual magic are based on the idea that the flow of certain bodily fluids, understood as being not purely physical, but also with subtle or spiritual qualities, possess a particular power, and that this power can be manipulated and made effective through the use of sex as a catalyst. So there is the flow of these fluids in your body with certain techniques, bodily techniques, mental techniques, so psychophysical techniques. You can activate these fluids in a way that is going to create some kind of magical effect. Now, this is supposed to happen especially during sexual intercourse, in combination, therefore, with these particular bodily or mental techniques. Now, according to certain doctrines of sexual magic, the bodily fluids that result from intercourse or from other forms of sexual activity, for instance, masturbation, can be transmuted into medicines or elixirs that are perceived to possess the power to heal, rejuvenate, or make people immortal or godlike. Okay? We will get back to this, because the second part of the lecture will focus more on these aspects. Now, various scholars have suggested that there might be cases of sexual magic in Europe before the 19th century. For instance, with important figures for the history of Western esotericism, such as Giordano Bruno, Cagliostro, or William Blake. And there is some literature about this. But I think that the evidence for a full-blown theoretical and practical system of sexual magic before the mid-19th century is actually quite thin. So I think that what you can find in this literature are more speculations, hypotheses, but actual, concrete evidence, in my view, is still lacking. Whereas when we get to the 19th century, the evidence is there. So it's clear that these people were doing this kind of stuff. Now, the first author who clearly developed this kind of system of sex magic was the American spiritualist and early occultist Pascal Beverly Randolph. Now, I am not going to summarize here the whole history of sexual magic in all its, stages and developments. We will focus on one of these aspects later on, but I don't think it is necessary to do a kind of summary of the whole history for two reasons. One, because I don't have enough time, and two, because in fact many of the aspects of this story are still unclear, because there is insufficient research, and some of the moments of this history we actually don't know or we don't understand well enough yet. And later on you will see how difficult in fact it is to do research on this topic. So let's return more to a few of these cultural and social aspects of the emergence of sexual magic. Now, to begin with, it is interesting to note that from the broader perspective of the history of religions, sex has often been used as a marker in order to characterize and stigmatize groups of people that, for one reason or another, were considered to be threatening or dangerous or in some way antisocial. Sexual practices perceived as abnormal or illicit, such as orgastic rites, sodomy, bestiality, masturbation, or the supposed intercourse with demons and other non-human beings, were attributed to these communities, these movements, these groups, and were thought to be a major component of their antisocial behavior. When one has a look at the groups that were historically targeted with such accusations in Europe, one realizes that this has been a recurring phenomenon in different cultural and geographical contexts. So we find it in fact in relation to various religious groups such as the Dionysiacs in antiquity, some Gnostic sects, the Bogomils, especially in the Balkan area, the Cathars, south of France, the Knights Templar, very famous example, the Rosicrucians, and the Russian sect of the Khlisti, also a bit less known but also important in this respect. Now, to these movements, which had real historical existence, we could also add movements that were largely the product of the imagination of the people who were persecuting them. And the clearest case, the clearest example of this is the example of the witches during the so-called witch craze of the early modern period. Now, in spite of all the significant differences between these groups, one pattern stands out, and it is precisely the accusation from their adversaries that these groups engage, among other things, in illicit sexual practices. Now, from an historical point of view, in most cases, it is unclear to what extent the sexual practices described in this polemical literature, in these accusations, were real, rather than the fantastic projection of the adversaries, of the inquisitors, for instance, in the case of the witches. Nonetheless, whatever the actual reality of these practices, they produced a sulfurous, very negative reputation that stuck to these movements and became part of their image even long they had ceased to exist. So even when they didn't exist anymore, still people remembered about the fantastic sexual practices of these groups. And this is the reason why, when sexual magic made its appearance in the 19th century, some of the people who were involved in the emergence of sexual magic felt the need to reactivate what they thought was the legacy of some of these groups. And it is no wonder, therefore, that the practices of sexual magic being performed in the occultist groups of that period would take place in the framework of a Gnostic, Rosicrucian, Templar, or even witch-like kind of situation. So these groups would call themselves Neo-Gnostics, or actually Gnostics, quite simply, Templars, and so on. And now you understand why. Why they were sort of reactivating these names and taking them for themselves. Now, this would fit into a narrative that saw these groups as part of a long countercultural tradition of the West, where true hidden wisdom related to sexuality would have been concealed. Now, a second point that is interesting to consider is that sexual magic often has the image of being a European white male affair, which would have emerged in the context of early 20th century occultism. So that's the typical image. When you have a kind of superficial knowledge of this story, these are the authors you may come across, firstly. And they're all white, of course, men from Europe. Okay, so that's the first picture that you would get. So here we have the German occultist and Freemason Theodor Reuss, the English man that was mentioned also earlier, on which I have written a book, Aleister Crowley, and the Italian Giuliano Kremerz, perhaps a bit less known. Now, if you take a closer look at this story, you look at the evidence, you realize that in fact the situation is much more complicated. And you start to realize that the beginnings of sexual magic probably are more to be situated in North America and in the 1860s, 1870s, rather than in the early years of the 20th century in Europe. And I mentioned Pascal Lee Beverly Randolph, and you can see already that this case is totally different from the ones we have here. So in fact, he was a man of color. He was of mixed descent, African American, and white descent. He was a spiritualist originally, and he was in America. So that's already a more complicated picture. And it gets even more complicated when we see that, in fact, at the early stages, there were also quite a few women involved in this story. So not only men. And to give a few examples on which I will return later. So we have here the American spiritualist and feminist agitator Victoria Claflin Woodhull, the Anglo-Spanish spiritualist and early theosophist Maria Mariátegui Sinclair, also known as Lady Caithness, and the American esotericist and sexual activist Ida Craddock. Now, from what we know, Woodhull and Caithness were not practicing forms of sexual magic themselves. But in their works, one can find the theoretical premises for these practices. That is, a positive appreciation of the body, and especially of the female body, which is important, as a tool for spiritual and magical experiences, and an understanding of sexual intercourse as a perfectly natural and enjoyable aspect of human life, irrespective of marriage and reproduction. Now, this introduces an interesting nuance into the almost universal anti-materialist attitude of spiritualists and occultists alike. Because the openness towards the use of sex for spiritual and magical purposes is also based on a positive vision of the material world. So it's not just about spirituality, but they are using their body in all its physical aspects. Now, the point is that when we describe the anti-materialism of occultists and spiritualists, we tend to forget that it was not so much the material world that they were rejecting, but the idea of an unbridgeable divide, so a kind of sharp separation between the spiritual world and the material world. So for them, the two were united. They were part of a single whole. Or they were also rejecting the idea that all reality could be reduced to matter, that there was nothing else. That was hard materialism that they certainly rejected. Now, a question that could be asked now is, why is it so that the earliest traces of sexual magic are to be found in the United States, North America, and that it was American authors who played such an important role in the beginning? The answer seems easy enough, and it has to do with the fact that it was much easier to experiment socially and religiously in the United States than in Europe, due to the vastness of the territory, large portions of which still belong to what was called the frontier. So there was no central administration there. Basically, people would go there and did whatever they liked. So due to that, to the vastness of the territory and to the religious diversity, which had always characterized the country since the earliest European settlers, it was certainly possible to engage in alternative practices and ideas with relatively less fear of persecution and stigmatization. This is also the reason why it is in the United States that one can observe in the same period or slightly earlier the emergence of new religious movements showing alternative or non-mainstream sexual practices, such as the Mormons, the Shakers, or the Oneida community. The Mormons are particularly important and famous in this respect. It's still a thriving, very important religious movement today, whereas other movements like the Oneida community was important then, but it has now disappeared. Now, a further point that I think should be mentioned here is what I would define as the heterogenesis of ends of modern Western esotericism, which is also mentioned in the abstract that you probably have at your disposal. Now, what is the heterogenesis of ends? By this I mean that when we analyze modern Western esotericism, we realize that the cultural and social relevance of esotericism may go beyond the explicit intentions of the esotericists themselves, which means that sometimes they were doing things thinking that their only purpose and goal was something like a spiritual goal or a magical goal, and they did not necessarily think about the social or cultural implications of what they were doing. So it is possible to see the formation of progressive discourses and practices that anticipate later developments in mainstream culture, independently from whether the esotericists who proposed them had a conscious progressive agenda. And this is what I have discussed also in other earlier publications in relation to the problem of the modernity of esotericism, the modernity of occultism. Also trying to suggest some explanations as to why these progressive elements can be found in modern Western esotericism around the 19th century and early 20th century. And I think sexuality is precisely one of the aspects of modern esotericism where this becomes particularly evident. Now, in the literature related to sexual magic in the second half of the 19th century, we find, for instance, discussions about reproduction, birth control, free love, female orgasm that could not find significant space, at least in such progressive terms, in other social contexts at the time. Authors such as Randolph, Woodhull, Caithness, Craddock include in their publications these discussions, and in so doing, they open up new perspectives about human sexuality. The importance attributed to female orgasm, together with practical instructions for men about how to help their partners to reach it, is a particularly interesting example, as it candidly tackles a subject that at the time had not received so much attention, even in the emerging sexological literature. If you took what scholars, scientists were writing when they were talking about sex, you will not find so much about female orgasm, for instance. This is actually a subject that begins to be studied seriously much later, in the 60s, 1960s, not 1860s, so imagine. So the rationale for these discourses was spiritual, esoteric, and magical in its original context. And this is why it has been, in fact, neglected by historians of sexuality. They don't talk about this kind of stuff. But the social and cultural significance becomes evident to us today when we look at this material with other eyes than those of the esotericists themselves. So we look beyond their intentions. We look beyond their purposes. We are interested in the social relevance of what they were doing. And it doesn't matter whether, magic really functioned or not. We don't care as scholars. We care more about the implications that we can draw from these kind of practices. Okay, so this is the first part, and these are the social and cultural aspects of sex magic. And now I would move to the second part, but before I would like to ask how much time I still have, and when do I have to stop? Exactly at what time? So whether I have to rush, I don't have the program here, so I don't remember it. 10 minutes?
I think you have easily half an hour.
Half an hour?
Yeah,
oh, wow, so I can tell you everything then. Fantastic. Okay, so now what I am going to do for the second part of this lecture is focusing on one aspect of this story, and to show you, by taking a case study, how complicated it is sometimes to do research on such a subject. So, does anybody have an idea of what this is? No? It's? Almost. In fact, you don't see it, but it's blue. It's blue, okay. It's a blue dress. And the person who was wearing this blue dress entered between November 1995 and April 1997 many times in a place called the Oval Office at the White House in Washington. And this was, in fact, a young stage person whose name was Monica Lewinsky, and now probably you see where I'm going with this, who had some kind of close encounters with the then US President, Bill Clinton. And these close encounters involved also a sexual connotation, because what happened, or at least what was claimed that happened, was that Monica Lewinsky engaged in oral intercourse, oral sexual intercourse with the president. And why is this dress important? Because some of the president's semen was supposed to have spilled on that dress. So at some point during the trial that followed this story, I spare you all the details, this was in all news, because this dress had to be analyzed by some scientists in order to see whether the semen was really there, and whether, if the semen was really there, to whom it belonged. So with the DNA kind of tests and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to see that for weeks and weeks, in basically most of the newspapers of the world, there was a lot of talk about one very famous bodily fluid, or rather the bodily fluid of a very famous person. So why am I taking this as an example? Because I think that if you start thinking about it, you will realize that the cultural history of bodily fluids has never been written. So we all have bodily fluids in our body. They serve very important functions in our body. Without them, we would die. It's very clear. But interestingly enough, there is not so much literature about them, especially the cultural aspect of bodily fluids. Of course, there is a lot of medical literature about them, but not so much how people have related culturally, especially in Western culture, to bodily fluids. And the reason probably is not so difficult to understand. It has to do with the stigma, or the kind of repulsion that we have sometimes towards bodily fluids. Think about it. When the bodily fluids are inside of the body, well, that's fine, that's okay. The moment they start to be outside of our body, they become dirty. So, well, in fact, there are many ways by which we could understand this. You know that there is this famous theory whereby, put forward by anthropologist Mary Douglas, whereby nothing is really dirty. Things are dirty only when they are in the wrong place. And that's exactly what happens with bodily fluids. When they are in the body, they are okay, but okay, when you put them out of your body, then there is this kind of strange reaction towards them. So probably the fact that not so many people, not so many scholars are willing to tackle this subject has something to do with that. But interestingly enough, even in Western culture, there are places where the kind of discourse about bodily fluids can take place almost, without raising too many eyebrows, so to speak. In fact, this is not really the case, but I will show you in what sense. So apart from this example, this egregious example of the president's semen, one context where you can really talk about bodily fluids without fearing too much retaliation is this. Anybody has a clue of what this is? This is a work of art by a very famous French artist called Marcel Duchamp. Actually the inventor, so to speak, of contemporary art, so in a certain sense. leading figure of the artistic avant-garde, he produced this work in 1946 and he called it Paysage Fautif, faulty landscape. And well, he didn't say exactly how he did it, and then he died, and it ended in the hands of an art collector who sometimes in the late 90s, early 2000s, had the idea of having an analysis of the materials just to understand the technique by which this was produced. Sometimes this is also necessary when there are questions about the authenticity of a work of art, because we are talking about things that can have a value of millions of euros sometimes, right? So the analysis gave an unexpected result, because it turned out that in fact Duchamp produced it with its own semen. He basically masturbated on this, it was a plate of zinc, and then the chemical reaction after a while produces this very nice, well, very nice, I mean this is subjective of course, but produces this kind of result. Another example, Italian artist Piero Manzoni, artist shit. And this you can see how contemporary art has something to do with magic actually, because what did this artist do? He basically defecated and put his own feces into a number of cans, a limited number of cans of course, and then he signed it and he put a label on that. So he really said what it was, artist shit, so different from Duchamp who didn't say it. He said it. And then, well, after a while, he started to sell them. Then he died actually quite young, unfortunately. So when an artist dies, his works become even more valuable. Not always, but sometimes. And now, this can of shit is worth, I think, 300,000 euro. So that's why I was saying that this, you can see how the connection between magic and contemporary art can work. Because this guy was able literally to turn his shit into gold, right? He didn't enjoy it because he was dead. So it was more the collectors and the gallerists, but still, you know, the alchemical magical process is still there. Last example, Andres Serrano, Peace Christ, very controversial piece, and this is where things get a bit less funny, because this artist produced in 1997 a photograph, because the work of art is really a photograph, which depicts a crucifix, as you can see, immersed into the artist's own urine, or piss, as he himself calls it. Well, and then he presented it as a work of art in exhibitions and so on. And in fact, I think there hasn't been one single exhibition of this work without somebody coming up with a knife or something and trying to, you know, to destroy it, because it's obviously offensive to Christians, right, who would strongly object to this. But it shows how the use of bodily fluids does produce this kind of response, this kind of emotional response. So that's why contemporary artists are so very much into it, right, because they like to provoke this kind of response. So these are all examples of how interesting it would be to write this cultural history of bodily fluids. But in fact, one place where a future historian of bodily fluids would have to look into is precisely the story I have been talking about earlier, which is sexual magic. So in this case, we are going to talk about the way in which bodily fluids play a role in sexual magic. There are different forms of sexual magic. In some of them, bodily fluids play a role inside of the body, so then they don't have to get out. There are techniques whereby, you know, you have some kind of sexual stimulation, but at the end you don't have orgasm or ejaculation. So in that case, for men, or also for women actually, the fluids remain into the body and are supposed to play a kind of magical function inside of the body. But there are other forms where the bodily fluids get out. So there is full sexual intercourse, orgasm, ejaculation, production of bodily fluids, and then once they are there, you use them. Okay? So one guy who actually experimented a lot precisely with this kind of stuff, with this kind of experiments, is this guy. So Aleister Crowley. So I won't get so much into you know, biography or stuff. You can read my book if you are interested, but there is a lot of stuff also online. So the thing to be important, the thing that you have to keep in mind is that he represents the later part of the story. So not the early part of the story that I was referring to earlier, which is the one I would like to focus on for a moment here, but rather the later part of the story. The male-dominated part of the story, the European part of the story, and I would say also the phallocentric side of the story. So let's not get into too much details about this, but let's focus more on what I am perhaps more interested in this story. So going backwards and trying to understand how this guy, this Aleister Crowley, got the idea of using bodily fluids for magic. So, and just to make you understand what I am talking about, the use of bodily fluids in that context means that you produce them and then you ingest them. You eat them. Because they are supposed to have been energized through the magical process. And when you ingest them, it's like eating that kind of elixir that I was talking about earlier. So this would have some kind of magical power, some magical effects on your body. There are other possibilities, like using these fluids in order to smear objects to produce talismans, and they become powerful objects. So you take these fluids and you put them on these objects. It could be a piece of paper, it could be a stone, something else, and then you have a powerful object. So this is what I am talking about. This is the use of bodily fluids I'm talking about. So where did someone like Crowley take this idea? The usual story that was widespread until recently was that he got it from India. He was influenced from Tantra, by Tantra. So in Tantrism, in fact, you do have these kind of practices in certain aspects of Tantrism, not all of them. So the connection was clear. Crowley went to India, he met somebody or he read something, and then, well, this is where he got the idea. Clear? No, not so much. Not so much because Crowley didn't read Sanskrit. He went to India, but so far as we know, he really didn't meet people who were practicing this kind of stuff. So, and most importantly, the idea was around even before him and had nothing to do with Tantra. So here is why we get to talk about this guy, and what I am going to do here is trying to go backwards in this story. So starting from Crowley, going backwards. So this was a Belgian aristocrat, a military man called Georges Leclément de Saint-Marc, who lived in Belgium, was a kind of, belonged to the social elite of his country, coming from an aristocratic family, engaging in an aristocratic, in a military career, was a Freemason, which in Belgium at the time meant that if you got to the top of Freemasonry, you really belonged to a certain kind of political and social elite. So someone who was someone at that time. In 1906, he published a pamphlet called L'Eucharistie, the Eucharist. And what he presented in this pamphlet was an outrageous theory. It was the idea that, in fact, the story that we are told in the church, the story that we read in the gospel, hides a secret. And the secret is that during the Last Supper, when Jesus Christ gave the bread and wine to his disciples, well, in fact, this is not exactly what happened. That, in fact, what Jesus Christ really gave the apostles on that occasion before his death was his semen. Okay? So that, in fact, this was the hidden mystery of all the Christian tradition. And not only that Jesus Christ did this, so this was the real Eucharist. Not only he did that, but in fact that the whole apostolic succession and the whole tradition of Christianity after him continued in this way. So that, in fact, the clergy and the high representatives of all Christian churches have been practicing this all along. But they are not saying it. They are lying. So they tell us lies. We are sort of naive because we didn't find out about this secret, but this is what really happens in the history of Christianity. Now, of course, this is a crazy theory. He lost everything with this, because when rumor came out that he had published this, his career was broken in the military, in the army. He was dismissed from Freemasonry, rejected from Freemasonry, and basically he had to retire in his own property. He was a rich man, an aristocrat, so perhaps he didn't care so much, but basically he spent the rest of his life in isolation, keeping on publishing all these pamphlets and books where he just repeated again and again the same story. And he also published a journal called Le Sincerist. Why Le Sincerist? Because he believed that he was the only one saying the truth, that everybody else was lying, and therefore his movement was called Sincerism, because he was being sincere. Now basically this journal was published for 30 years, and it was a monthly journal, and he was writing the whole of it. He was almost the only contributor of this journal. Well, you can sort of guess why. Well, but he did have some following. You see, he did have some following. And the interesting thing is that this literature was read by the German occultist that I mentioned earlier, Theodor Reuss, who was read by Crowley. So here we have the connection between the two. So here we have the link. But the interesting thing is that among the things that you can find in this journal that were not written by this guy, by Georges Le Clément de Saint-Marc, there was at some point a series of abstracts taken from a book. And they were called Le Jardin d'Éden, so the Garden of Eden. And this was, in fact, a kind of very strange interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis, of the Bible. So a kind of very metaphorical interpretation. And there was also an indication of the source from which this was taken. So in each issue, monthly issue of Le Sincerist, Le Clément de Saint-Marc would publish a piece taken from that book. And the source was a book titled L'Ouverture des Sceaux, published by Lady Caithness. So this book was, in fact, a book that this spiritualist, occultist woman published almost at the end of her life, in 1893. Now, this woman is actually not known for having anything to do with sexuality, sexual magic. This is a discovery, so to speak. So, in fact, nobody has really studied Lady Caithness because everybody found her a bit boring. She belongs to the early history of the Theosophical Society, the minor figures of the Theosophical Society. Everybody's interested in Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, you know, these kind of people. Poor Lady Caithness did not receive much attention. And in fact, when you read their books, they are in fact a bit boring. But unfortunately, this is also why nobody noticed what she was writing in this book before. So what you can find in this book is precisely that kind of interpretation, exegesis, in fact, of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and especially focusing on the Garden of Eden. So what's the idea? What's the interpretation of this of Genesis that you find there? The interpretation is that, in fact, the Garden of Eden is nothing else but the human body. It stands for the human body. This is the story that you should read into the text, into the biblical text. So there is a literal meaning, and then there is, you know, the metaphorical meaning, which is the true one. It's the real one. And so if the Garden of Eden is the human body, so what are the famous 4 rivers that flow into the Garden of Eden? And here you see some traditional depictions of these 4 rivers. What could this be? Bodily fluids. Bodily fluids. That's right. So in fact, what you see in that book is an interpretation whereby, in fact, there is a kind of hidden message, a secret message in the text of the Bible. And the Bible really speaks about corporal bodily functions. And in fact, one river stands for urine, one river stands for feces, defecation, one river stands for blood, and one river stands also for menstrual blood. So this is really important because this is where it gets also sexualized. Okay, so I am going to read a few quotations so you will understand where this is going. How much time do I have left?
Let's say 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So, now you will get an idea of how interesting this really is. It is entirely wrong to think that this river of blood from which the bodily system of women should be cleared, so this is really menstrual blood, is corrupted and lifeless. It is precisely the same matter which gives shape to the body of a child. And when it is not used in this way, when it does not produce a child, according to God's intention, it should be used to renew the depletion of the adult body. This usage of what now gets lost constitutes one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible. It is the redemption of the body saved from death. Doctors may not know this, but they should. So, wow, what? What are we reading here? So, I mean, there is no way in which you can interpret it other than seeing the idea that menstrual blood, when, of course, it does not get involved into the production of a fetus, because there is no conception, and then it's usually expelled from the female body, it should not get wasted. It can still have a function, and this function is rejuvenation of the human body, or it has a purpose for human health, so to speak. So who will then prevent those who know these things from proclaiming them? Who will tell persons in old age that there is a balm in Gilead, of course a biblical reference, that can give youth back to them and save them from death by introducing them into the kingdom of God? Who will tell the sick and cursed race that there is a source of living water that can heal them, if they would only drink from it, which will appease the burning hell that makes them suffer? That there is a country where milk and honey flow, a tree and the river of life to satisfy all human needs? Who will dare to say that? And yet, these are the very things that any living soul can obtain, because God has put them at their disposal. The kingdom of God is in us all, and one only has to search in order to find it and enjoy it. So what we have, there is a lot to unpack here, and unfortunately I cannot do it because I have to rush now. But the important thing is that here we have a conception of the body as something that is absolutely positive, natural, and that in fact produces things that can help us to reach some kind of higher state of existence. In this case, especially rejuvenation. The mystery of God that is hidden in Jesus Christ and sealed in the Bible is the path through which the creative forces within man and woman, forces that were perverted at the time of the fall, must be used and become the elixir of life, instead of being what they are now, the curse of death. Elixir of life. Elixir of life, precisely that kind of substance that alchemists were supposed to produce, that were supposed to be ingested, consumed, and which would have magical effects on your body. The interesting thing is the language that is being used here. All of this is being framed in a kind of traditional Christian language, right? So the opposite of what one would expect when one reads the usual story. Okay, you have Crowley, he went to India, he met Tantra and this kind of stuff. Well, here we are in a totally different context, which is years and years before Crowley was even into the picture of that story. We do not intend to say that the relationship between the sexes, as it ought to be, should deprive either of them of the happiness that can be felt by the heart in the union through the senses. No, on the contrary, this happiness will be even enhanced beyond anything that can be imagined. So, the use of this fluid, so to speak, can have these magical effects, rejuvenation and so on, but there is something else. It's also about orgasm. Pleasure, bodily pleasure. This is not wrong, this is not bad. If God gave this to us, then we have to use it, and it's okay. So we have here a message that in fact subverts all the vision of the body and especially of bodily pleasure, that were predominant at the time in a kind of mainstream Christian context. So you see how subversive this kind of message was. Now you can find examples of this kind of message in other authors, also part of the same kind of context at the time. So we are really talking about 1880s, 1890s. And in this case, we have a very famous theosophist, figure of the early history of theosophy, Anna Kingsford, and Edward Maitland also, who was her collaborator. So we find examples of the same kind of attitude, examples that nobody has seen before, that were just not perceived. People were not focusing on this. The Hermetic system is distinguished from other schools of mysticism by its freedom from their glooming and churlish manner of regarding nature, and their contempt and loathing for the body and its functions as inherently impure and vile. And so far from repudiating the relations of the sexes, it exalts them as symbolizing the loftiest divine mysteries and enjoins their exercise as a duty, the fulfillment of which, in some at least of his incarnations, is essential to the full perfectionment and initiation of the individual. So, in Hermeticism, in Esotericism, you have an understanding of the body, of physicality, of nature, that is the opposite of the traditional Christian one. Okay, so in Christianity devalues the body, but we esotericists have a totally different understanding of it. So now we are getting to the end, because, I am going backwards, but where did Lady Caithness, when she wrote that book, L'Ouverture des Sceaux, the opening of the seals, where did she get this idea? Well, she got it from this woman. This woman is actually a very interesting figure. Well, I wouldn't say neglected figure, but certainly a neglected figure in this history that I am talking about. So, Victoria Woodhull was one of the most extraordinary women of the 19th century. Now, she had a lot of charisma, had a strong personality, intelligence, and she was involved in all sorts of controversies and scandals. And she's remembered today for being the first ever female candidate for US presidency. Well, 1 century before Hillary Clinton, really, which brings us back to the beginning. But she now also was the first translator of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, the manifesto of the Communist Party. Yeah? So I don't know whether this is something good or bad, but still you can see how influential and important she was at the time. She was an advocate of social reform, sexual education, and one of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement in America. And she was also an advocate of free love. Now, life is complicated, full of twists and turns. She even went to prison. She was a stockbroker in Wall Street, all sorts of crazy things that you would not imagine. So read a biography of her because it's really amazing. She was the leader of spiritualism in her own time. She became the president of the American Association of the Spiritualists at some point. Nobody thought that she would be involved in that story, though. Well, this is a journal that she published, controversy about it. I have to run a little bit. But I found that, in fact, she published a series of pamphlets at some point in the 1870s. And one of these pamphlets was called Breaking the Seals, which is exactly the title of Lady Caithness's book. And when you compare what's in this pamphlet, in the chapter of Lady Caithness's book, you realize that, in fact, it's the same text. So, in fact, Lady Caithness took this idea from her, from Victoria Woodhull, who until now nobody suspected as having anything to do with the history of sexual magic. Now, okay, I have to conclude, unfortunately, and I have to wrap it up, and just let me, so at this moment, summarize the main points that I made during this long excursus. So first of all, the roots of sexual magic are primarily in the US rather than in Europe, and I think this is significant and important. Some roots of sexual magic are in spiritualism, not in occultism. So these later people, Crowley, Royce, and so on, they were occultists, but there was an earlier tradition of spiritualism where we find the roots of this discourse of sexual magic. Discourse about spiritual sexuality developed in Christian terms, not in pagan ones. Because sometimes you think, okay, well, rediscovery of paganism, so new appreciation of nature, of the body, well, this fits with the pagan discourse. Well, no, because actually we find it also very much in a kind of Christian framework. Well, of course, you would say a kind of alternative Christian discourse, but still Christian nevertheless. This discourse was strongly related to sex radicalism, social reform, and feminism. Some of the most important early protagonists of this discourse were women. Spiritual sexuality emerged before and or independently from the influence of East Asian traditions. This is probably a tradition that starts by itself within Western culture, and then at some point gets combined with influences coming also from, outside of the West, so to speak. And finally, this is obviously an important chapter in the history of the changing perceptions of the body and the role of bodily fluids in contemporary culture. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. We have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Marco, for your speech. It's very amazing condition for understand this joint sex and the magical practice. There are the first possibility for understand the first point and the fourth point. There is cosmic eros and sexual magic. Is the concept of Eka in Egypt. The concept of magic. Eka, but also the forces natural. The forces natural, microcosmos and microcosmos is the same, and the action and reactions create metaphysical states of consciousness, developing all the actions and clearest Egyptians. For one question, it's probably that found in 3rd century reasons for speak about sexual poems in the troubadours of the Sicilian school with the Fedeli d'Amore and the traductions of the Song of the Sons. The Song of the Sons is very important for understand the anagogical way interprets not only the Bible, but the states of consciousness. This. For another side, the concept, the historical concept of logos spermaticos, and the connecting with the plasma sperm, because the logos spermatics is inside the man, but this the references directly to logos solar. It's possible to.
Yes. So I would say that generally it's clear why you could develop a kind of sexualized vision of the universe. And this is because, starting from antiquity, you have the idea that the universe is an organism. It's a body. So it's the body of usually a grand man. And this idea, in fact, has a very important following in esoteric literature up to our days. You find it in modern esotericists like Swedenborg, for instance. So there is a kind of continuity in this idea, even when the idea, of course, loses its validity from a scientific point of view or from a philosophical point of view. you can see that in esoteric literature this idea remains very much alive. So it's clear that when you think about the universe as a kind of big organism, like a huge animal being or human being, then the idea is that this has some kind of deep connections with the individuals living on this planet, so that in fact it's a kind of image, mirror image of one of the other. So this is the idea of the macrocosm and the microcosm. So insofar as the human being has also a sexual side, so the implication is then also the macrocosm must have a sexual side. So in fact, you have this idea in many traditions. It's not just, for instance, in the, let's say, in the pagan tradition or the Greco-Roman tradition that you find this. You find it also in Jewish mysticism, in the Kabbalah. There is the idea of the Adam Kadmon, the kind of grand man. So these are ideas that are very much widespread. And on the other hand, what I think is important is the idea that love, so not just love understood as sex here, as we understand it as sex, but love also as a force of attraction that brings things together or persons together, is supposed to be a kind of universal law. So not something that works for persons, but something that works at all levels of reality. So that in fact is a kind of glue, is a kind of thing that keeps, the universe together. Now you could say that the secular version of this idea is gravity, this power of attraction. But this is just, the kind of version of that idea that has been sort of purified from what, scientists believe to be metaphysical, superstitious, or mystical aspects of reality. So this is the thing. And, the idea of the logos spermatikos and all these ideas related to ancient philosophy from Stoicism, not just Platonism, but other traditions, they have been studied by important scholars. There is this book by Ioan Culianu, Romanian historian of religion, who the title is Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, and it's all about this. There is also a chapter on Giordano Bruno. So it's a kind of intellectual story of these ideas, of how these ideas started out in antiquity and had a new life, so to speak, in the Renaissance, after the discovery of of Greco-Roman culture and especially Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and so on.
More questions? I myself was quite surprised that there is no roots actually in peasant culture in this esoteric sex discourse, because when we look in peasant culture, agriculture, peasant culture in Europe, let's say, where fertility magic is in a very important place, and nevertheless some bodily practices are used in whatever ways, imitating ways, so on. There is no trace about this.
Yeah. Well, I think that if you read, literature of anthropology and folklore and so on, you have all sorts of references to the use of bodily fluids, for instance. Starting with James Fraser, for instance, it's, in Fraser there is a lot of stuff about the use of menstrual blood and all these kind of things. So it's not something that is unique or something that you don't find in other contexts. What is interesting is that Esotericism is a kind of high culture tradition. So it's a kind of intellectual tradition, which means that it belongs to a certain kind of social elite, the elite of educated people, which now in contemporary times is widespread, but as you go back in history, it's more and more rarefied. So we are really talking about a social elite, people like Giordano Bruno or Marsilio Ficino. They really belong to a sort of intellectual elite of the time. So this means that we are talking about a context that is slightly different from the kind of more popular traditions or rituals that in fact do exist and sometimes also make use of this kind of stuff. Obviously, some of this material sometimes is not easy to study, is not easy to find, or requires careful contextualization. What is more difficult to find, however, I think, is the ritualized use of sex. And I'm talking about really about sexual intercourse. Because what we are talking about here, in this case, is people, typically a man and a woman, but not necessarily, because there are also homosexual versions of sexual magic. There are forms of sexual magic that you can practice alone with masturbation. So the idea that these kind of practices become formalized. They become formalized, they become part of a body of literature where you have instructions about how to use this. And this is included into a broader corpus of esoteric literature. So it becomes one aspect of a bigger picture of esotericism. And I think this is what makes sexual magic quite specific. Because you did find this kind of rituals and practices in other cultures, in Taoism, in China, in Tantra, of course, in India. You find things that are actually comparable, similar in some respects to this, but which belong also to other cultural contexts, of course. And these other traditions in other cultures are much older. You actually have a much longer history. Why? Well, because, to put it very, very simply, because there was no Christianity to put a sense of sin, of guilt on these practices. I mean, it's a bit ironic because, as you can see, this also starts in a Christian context in the end. So the first discourse that sort of legitimizes these practices is really Christian, you see? But it's a totally alternative version of the Christian interpretation of the texts. So, yeah, this more or less is how I look. But I have to say that there is still so much to think about and to research about these issues. So I would be very interested, for instance, in interacting with specialists of folklore studies in order to understand how much of what you can find there might have counterparts or similarities to, you know, practices that you can find in other contexts, let's say more popular contexts.
My question might be really naive, but your conclusion said that discourses about spiritual sexuality developed in Christian terms and pagan one, like you were mentioning. I'm just wondering whether it is only in the case of European or American version, or because it's like the institutionalized religion were much more stronger in these other parts of the world. Like, for example, just now we were talking about like esoteric sex in Tibetanized tradition, or even to that extent Kama Sutra, things like that. So, yeah.
Well, you know, now here we are getting to a very, very big question. So I don't know whether I am even able to respond to it. You know, because the big problem is the relationship between sex and religion more generally here. You know, sexuality and religion. I think that sex is probably an aspect of human life that is perceived as, let's say, threatening, potentially dangerous, or at least so powerful that has to be considered with prudence. I think this is something that is widespread, and it's not necessarily related to Christian culture. I mean, in Christian culture or in Judeo-Christian culture, but especially in Christianity, you do have something else, something more, which is sin. You know, this particular sense of guilt that comes theologically from the notion of sin. Yeah?
But isn't it because of the cultural context?
Yeah, of course, of course. But what I would like to say is that even when you get outside of Christian culture, So outside of Europe, outside of the West, so to speak, to use a very, very broad kind of category that I am aware is so contested, but just, you know, to give an idea of what I mean. In other cultures as well, the use of sex is also formalized in such a way that is not necessarily easily accessible. And if you take the literature of Tantra, it's also literature that uses a very metaphorical kind of language, and sometimes it's not easy to understand what they are saying actually. And it's a bit like alchemy, that in fact there is the idea that you are sort of transmitting or conveying a kind of secret, but you don't want to say too openly. Why? Well, the implication is that the secret is so powerful or so dangerous that you don't want to put it at the disposal of everybody, that you want to take precautions, because if this goes in the hands of people who don't know how to use it, they can use it for evil purposes, or they can harm themselves, because they have not gone through a particular training, so as to learn how to use it properly. So I think that this idea is not necessarily Western or Christian. It's an idea that you find more generally in human culture, also in other contexts. So that means that probably the relationship to sexuality, also in other religious contexts, is something that does include usually this kind of prudent attitude, as if when you are dealing with the sphere of sex, you are dealing with something that doesn't go by itself. It's something that may be natural, but it's still potentially dangerous. But, yeah, I mean, it's a big question.
Well, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.